Welcome everyone to today's webinar on SWIFT customer security controls. Today's webinar will be recorded and available after the session is over. All lines will be muted throughout today's presentation, so if you have questions, please submit them through the questions box and our presenter will answer them at the end of our webinar. Today we'll hear from Lawrence Chen, Security Architect at Palo Alto Networks. Lawrence, I'll turn it over to you to kick us off.
Great, thank you, Cynthia. So today's topic is in fact the SWIFT customer security controls. But before we dive into that, let me just introduce myself real quickly, tell you a little bit about myself. I've been with Palo Alto Networks for about 2.5 years now. And prior to that, I had spent 17 years in the financial services industry, mostly in network engineering and network architecture roles. All right, so let's just get this going. All right, so here's our agenda for today, and as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about the SWIFT customer security controls, which of course are intended to protect the local SWIFT infrastructure as well as the well-being of that entire ecosystem. Now, however, I would like to point out that these same controls can essentially address improvements in cyber hygiene. So in that regard, these controls can be readily adapted and applied to other critical portions of your infrastructure besides your local SWIFT environments. So please keep that in mind as we go through the various controls. And just in case for folks who may not be familiar, SWIFT, of course, is a global member-owned cooperative, and they're a leading provider of financial messaging services. So really, what it's predominantly used for is to initiate fund transfers between financial institutions across the globe. SWIFT has about 11,000 members, banks, security, folks in the securities industry, and market infrastructure. But for today's agenda, we're kind of going to walk through, how did we, what were some of those breaches that occurred at SWIFT member institutions that ultimately led to the creation of this SWIFT customer security program, as well as then the introduction of these mandatory and advisory security controls. Next, we'll talk through some of the Palo Alto Networks capabilities that will help address these various controls. Talk through some additional best practices that can also further improve your cyber hygiene. And with that, we'll summarize and wrap up and end with Q&A. And of course, as was mentioned, feel free to type in questions in the question box as we go, and we'll get to the questions at the end. All right, so what actually happened? So over the past 3 years, there have been a series of attacks on a number of SWIFT member institutions across the globe. And these have occurred in at least 10 different countries. And the first batch came to light in early 2016. And the most recent attack actually was publicized just recently in actually occurred in late May and was just publicized recently in the press. So what actually happened in these cases? Well, typically what it was is that the local environments at these SWIFT member institutions was somehow bypassed, and after that initial compromise occurred, eventually that led to some credential theft, which was then used to initiate fraudulent fund transfers. And at this point, the total of those fund transfers is probably in the neighborhood of $200 million or so. Now, in some cases, what also occurred is that malware was introduced to delay detection of this fraud. So this involves things such as manipulating the logs and trying to clean up the audit trails, if you will, or to create a distraction elsewhere, while these fraudulent activities were occurring. Now, ultimately, the goal was to steal money, and as I mentioned, the total is in that ballpark of $200 million or so. Now, something else to bear in mind, and although it's not directly related to SWIFT or SWIFT members, again, in late April, it was reported that there was a series of attacks on a handful of financial institutions in Mexico, and those attacks also led to fraudulent fund transfers through their domestic payment system, something that goes by the initials SPEI. So, as I mentioned, although this is not directly related to SWIFT or the SWIFT member institutions, it's certainly another indication that members of payment networks continue to be targeted. So with that being said, let's take a quick look at what a typical attack looks like, a typical targeted attack looks like. So it usually begins with an attacker conducting some reconnaissance to determine the most convenient or vulnerable entry point at the targeted institution. Okay, and next, what the attacker will try to do is look to compromise an endpoint in order to establish a foothold in that environment. And this is generally done either by introducing malware directly or remotely. And certainly the latter includes things via email or certainly pointing the user or sending the user a link to a compromised website. Now, after successfully compromising an endpoint, then the attacker would attempt to establish communications to their own command and control infrastructure. And the idea there is to enable them to drive the next steps of the attack, which would involve lateral movement to discover other items of value. And in the case of these breached SWIFT member institutions, so in addition to stealing credentials, they would also conduct some further reconnaissance to familiarize themselves with the back office processes and systems. Now, once all these pieces are in place, the attackers can then complete their objective. So in the case of these SWIFT member attacks, that objective was to submit a number of fraudulent fund transfers. Now, to cover their tracks, as I mentioned before, several methods had been used, such as tampering with the reconciliation process for those fund transfers, which includes deleting or manipulating logs or records, and then also creating smoke screens with malware or ransomware. Now, the thing that we want to take away from this is that with such sophisticated attacks, there are really multiple steps that are required to ultimately realize the goal. And the mandatory and advisory security controls are intended to address those and create more hurdles, if you will, for the attackers and to reduce the likelihood of the attackers achieving their ultimate objective. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what happened over these past 3 years, just a quick summary of that. So the first set of attacks occurred in 2015. However, it was not obvious that these were related to one another. So it wasn't really until the attack on a bank in Bangladesh in 2016 that worldwide attention was brought to this. In that particular incident, $81 million of fund transfers were initiated fraudulently. And in the aftermath of that, it came to light that these earlier attacks in 2015 may not have been, in fact, isolated incidents, but related to this Bangladesh attack. Now, to SWIFT's credit, although the SWIFT network and the SWIFT environment itself was never compromised, they took it upon themselves to institute this customer security program, and the objective of that was to protect the entire ecosystem. Now, in 2017, additional attacks occurred across multiple countries, and the SWIFT security framework was laid out, which included details of the customer security controls that we're going to talk about in just a moment. Additionally, as part of that, a self-attestation was required at the end of 2017 for compliance with the mandatory controls. And really, the objective of that was to get a baseline from the SWIFT members on, what controls they may have in place at the end of last year. Now, in 2018, a couple more attacks occurred on banks in 2 different countries. So certainly, even though this started, 3 years ago in 2015, the threat is still very real. Now, additionally, the second self-attestation is due at the end of this year, and SWIFT is basically saying they're going to be a little more serious with this round of attestations, and they reserve the right to report noncompliance to local regulators, as well as to your SWIFT counterparties. All right, so here's just a quick look at how that SWIFT customer security controls framework is laid out. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but basically there are 3 main objectives that you can see in the middle of the page: secure your environment, know and limit access, detect and respond, and those are in fact supported by the 8 principles that you see there on the right-hand side of the page. Now, beyond that, or actually using this pyramid, below those 8 principles are in fact the 27 security controls that we're going to talk about. So, out of those controls, 16 of them are mandatory, 11 of them are called advisory controls, and really what that means is that they're optional, and they can certainly be just viewed as recommended best practices. And we're going to talk about these controls now, but in the interest of time, we're not going to walk through each control separately, but rather we'll group the controls into batches and we'll talk about them based on the area that they're meant to protect in your environment. And then, as I mentioned before, we'll talk about the various components of the Palo Alto Networks security operating platform that will help address each group. Okay, so before we dive into this, just want to point out a couple of things about the convention that I'm using here. So the mandatory controls are highlighted in boldface text. So for example, 1.1 is a mandatory control, and advisory controls are in italics, are italicized, and for example, 2.4a is a advisory control. And that numbering and naming convention is, in fact, SWIFT's. So with that out of the way, this very first set of controls really speaks to protecting the elements of the local SWIFT environment, as well as the traffic that passes in and out of there. So it's essentially a story about network segmentation of the local SWIFT components, and then tightly controlling the data flows into and out of that environment. So let me show you how this would be done on the following slide, on the next slide here. Okay, so the basic idea is to segment your network, and what you can do then is use the next generation firewalls to perform that segmentation. You can partition the local SWIFT infrastructure from the rest of your IT environment. Okay, and that's what you would use the firewalls for. And the idea there is with the firewalls in place, you can restrict the traffic flow to known good traffic or expected applications, and that will certainly limit any lateral movement by potential attackers. Of course, what you'd also like to be able to do is stop any dangerous file types and known threats, using intrusion detection services. And in the Palo Alto world, we would include that capability as part of our threat prevention subscription. Now, additionally, what you'd also want to do is to be able to identify even unknown threats, with advanced malware analysis capabilities, and then certainly be able to protect against them in as little as 5 minutes, and you can do that with our Wildfire service. Additionally, what you can do also with the next generation firewalls in place, is take advantage of our App ID technology, which provides greater visibility into and accuracy of the traffic flows beyond just merely basic port numbers and protocols. And in combination, this reduces the attack surface for the local SWIFT infrastructure that you would have. And then to protect against protect the external data transmissions, you can use URL filtering to stop traffic destined to phishing and command and control sites out on the internet. And of course, IDS and protection from unknown malware also makes sense at the network perimeter there as well. And of course, something else you can do there is sinkhole traffic to malicious domain names also, including any newly created ones. Now, of course, the next generation firewalls can log application traffic flows across the boundaries of those devices. And you can either do this locally on the next generation firewall or on a separate appliance that we would refer to as a log collector. Additionally, there's an option to collect logs in the cloud as well. Now, for even a closer look at potential malicious activity within your networks, we have a service called Magnifier that can add behavioral analytics and machine learning to identify advanced threats, based on data that we gather from the existing Palo Alto Networks components in your environment. Now, of course, this concept of network segmentation can be applied to any critical resource or data in your environment. This tactic, can be reused, to ultimately create a zero trust network where only authorized and expected traffic are allowed to cross those internal network boundaries. All right, so this next group of controls talks about really ensuring that that there's only authorized access to the local SWIFT-related systems is in place. So really, it kind of talks to applying the principle of least privileges for administrator accounts, and then you can certainly tie those administrator privileges to specific accounts or user IDs. Now, the security policy on the next generation firewall can be applied, based on particular administrative user IDs or user groups for that matter. And this allows you to limit access to certain systems to a specific set of user IDs. And as an example, what you can do here is then prevent an unauthorized user from even seeing the login page for a restricted application. So they never even have an opportunity to knock on that door, if you will. Now, also to ensure appropriate access, system access, and to reduce the likelihood of account takeover attacks, with Palo Alto Networks, you can also leverage credential theft prevention capabilities to stop the exfiltration of corporate login credentials to phishing or other unauthorized websites. And you can also use the next generation firewalls as a network-level multi-factor authentication gateway in front of the SWIFT-related systems for additional protection, even if credentials are stolen. Now, one thing I did want to point out there is that even though that approach doesn't require any changes on the application side to support multi-factor authentication. So let's take a closer look at credential theft and how Palo Alto Networks can help in that regard. So there are really three typical ways that credential theft occurs. And the first is really where the user receives a phishing email that entices them to click on a link under the guise that there's something important there to look at. So when the user clicks on that link and lands on a phishing landing page, they were prompted for their credentials to access that important content. So this, of course, this phishing page can be crafted to look like a legitimate corporate login page. So sometimes it's not obvious to spot those, unfortunately. And then, thirdly, once the attacker has credentials to the network, they're able to roam around and certainly try to steal additional credentials, and ultimately, get to the network resources that they're ultimately interested in. Now, I'm going to just walk through, those three capabilities that we have to address these attacks in a little more detail. And next. All right. So with the next generation firewall, you can configure it to send, links to, possible phishing emails to Wildfire for analysis. Now, if Wildfire then determines that the page is phishing, through advanced machine learning techniques, the page can then would be added to the phishing URL category in our PanDB service. Of course, this event would also be logged in the Wildfire audit trail for awareness. Now, if this analysis is conducted before the user actually clicks on the link, the next generation firewall, through the use of the PanDB URL categorization, can then block that URL before it's actually accessed by the user. Now, in this case, when the firewall actually sees, web traffic with credentials going to an unrecognized website, the firewall then takes advantage of our user ID technology to compare that with the corporate credentials of the user. So if there's a match, the firewall can be configured to alert or even drop that traffic to prevent the leakage of those valid corporate credentials. And then thirdly, let's say that a user's credentials have already been stolen somehow. Here, what the firewall can do is serve as a multi-factor authentication gateway, and certainly prompt for a multi-factor authentication challenge each time a new sensitive area of the network is accessed. And this is enforced using policy at the network level by the firewall, again. So it doesn't require any specific integration between your authentication provider and your application. So attempts to escalate privileges and move to more sensitive areas of your network without valid multi-factor authentication, would be prevented. So so here's just a summary slide that shows again the three techniques applied to the three different types of credential theft that are common. So we've already talked about them, don't really need to talk any more about this particular slide. All right, so getting back to the Swift controls, this next set is really talking about the integrity of the endpoints as well as the systems running on them. Now, as we know, for whatever reasons, software patching isn't always done in a timely fashion. So the idea then would be to be able to protect these unpatched or perhaps even unpatchable systems from exploits and malware with traps. Traps is Palo Alto Networks' advanced endpoint protection product, and it actually uses a multi-method approach to block both known and unknown threats without relying on signatures. Now, Traps also has integration with our Wildfire threat analysis service that enables dynamic analysis and identification of new malware, as well as the creation of new protection and new prevention in as little as 5 minutes. So this ultimately protects endpoints from exploits and malware that may attempt to inject malicious code for execution. Now, Traps can also prevent fingerprint scanning by exploit kits. And the idea there is to restrict the attacker's ability to discover operating system or other application information. Now, even during an ethical scan, Traps can also prevent the discovery and exploitation of vulnerabilities or identification of vulnerabilities through those techniques. So let's take a little closer look at how Traps works and what's our approach for protecting endpoints. So by combining multiple methods of prevention, traps blocks security breaches and successful ransomware attacks that leverage malware and exploits, whether known or unknown, before they can compromise those endpoints. Now, in most cases, the goal of the attacker is to successfully execute some malicious application on the endpoint, which essentially gives them complete control of that device. Now, to take advantage of the opportunities for prevention on the endpoint, multiple methods of prevention are required. The first is you want to be able to get a fast verdict and response on what may appear to be bad. So to do that, Traps leverages Wildfire's threat intelligence to quickly determine if the threat had been previously seen. Now, furthermore, Traps also uses local machine learning to identify new threats, which ultimately are trained through analysis of millions of both good and bad files. And then, lastly, Traps also will send any new threats that it identifies to Wildfire for additional dynamic analysis in the Wildfire Threat Intelligence Cloud. So the concept here is, Traps uses multiple methods of prevention to provide, more opportunities to prevent an attack, under the premise that no single method can provide 100% coverage. Now, we all know that every piece of software and every application has some flaws or programming bugs. Some of these create vulnerabilities in the software that an attacker can take advantage of. Now, some of these vulnerabilities are known and others are unknown. And of course, when a vendor discovers those flaws, they issue a security patch to fix the flaws and to eliminate that vulnerability. But then the onus is on you to implement and deploy those software patches. However, the unknown, if you will, or the yet-to-be-discovered vulnerabilities can still be exploited by an attacker. And these are the ones that are generally called zero-day exploits. And what we're seeing now is also, even perhaps more importantly, is some attacks don't even involve files anymore. Attackers simply leverage the exploit to carry out a script-based fileless attack. So here again, Traps would use multiple methods which focus really on the exploit technique, rather than the exploit itself. And this is fundamental to the approach we take with Traps. And the idea is that we want to prevent the exploit technique with very high degrees of accuracy so that we're not chasing each and every exploit. And this approach against zero-day exploits and even unpatched machines ensures that you'll have protection against machines that you either cannot patch or certainly haven't gotten to, or perhaps may be even past the end of support by the vendor. Okay, and then what we have here is with attacks becoming more and more sophisticated, it's more important now than ever to have your entire security infrastructure working in unison. Now, in order to effectively keep attacks out of all points across your network, your endpoints, as well as from the cloud, you need to have the same threat intelligence to ensure maximum protection. So having rich network, endpoint, and cloud data centralized in a single service where you can apply analytics, context, and classification is critical to be able to quickly and accurately identify threats and then just shut them down. Now, so the platform that consolidates this threat information and this log data needs to be able to adapt to new applications as well as new threat intelligence feeds, and also to be able to extend its capabilities as new services are developed to ensure you're staying ahead of your adversaries. All right, so this next set of controls covers the traffic that's generated by the privileged users of the local Swift components. And so let's take a look at how operator and or administrator traffic can be protected in this environment. So ideally, all the operator workstations would be within the separated and protected local SWIFT infrastructure that you see there on the right, shaded in that, I guess it's a light red. However, that may not be possible, right? You may certainly have some remote operators. Now, regardless of where the operators are, all the operator workstations should have advanced endpoint protection with traps. Now, moreover, traffic flows from the remote operator workstations into the local SWIFT infrastructure should be controlled by a next-generation firewall. Now, as further protection of data that may be in transit from the operator workstations to the local SWIFT environment, Global Protect may be used to establish an IPsec VPN to that next-generation firewall. And again, if you apply that principle of least privileges to limit the remote operator access to a specific group of users by user ID, this way you limit folks who can even try to get into that local SWIFT environment. And of course, you can also add filtering by application ID, so you can limit to what particular applications they can get to within that environment as well. So in other words, the idea here is to restrict access based on the user's role, as well as the specific functions that they need to access in that protected SWIFT environment. All right. So this set of controls talks about managing the risk that's associated with using third parties. Now, financial institutions have become certainly more and more reliant over time on the use of third-party partners to realize their business objectives. However, this creates yet another avenue that cyber attackers may attempt to exploit. So on the next slide, we're going to take a look at how do we address the risk associated with third-party access. All right, so again, to kind of state the obvious, you want to use the next generation firewall at the business-to-business network perimeter to control access from third-party partners. Of course, you'd want to use the threat prevention and wildfire services to identify and then stop anomalous traffic as well as malware. You can also use the next generation firewall to limit third-party access based on their user identity, as well as using App ID to limit them to a predefined set of sanctioned applications. Of course, the idea here is not to enable access beyond the minimum required for their role. Now, the perimeter firewall can also enforce multi-factor authentication challenges for the third parties and ask them for additional credentials. Again, this would be done at the network level, which doesn't require any changes on a per application basis. So for completeness, here's the rest of the SWIFT mandatory and advisory controls that we haven't talked about yet. As you can see, besides 6.3, which talks about database integrity, the rest of these are all related to people and processes at your financial institution. And just for complete transparency, these are not areas where the Palo Alto Networks security operating platform would play a role. However, that being said, 7.4a, where that talks about scenario risk assessment, Palo Alto Networks does in fact offer complementary security lifecycle reviews and prevention posture assessments that could provide some insights into the risks that you have within your specific environments. So with that, we've covered actually all 27 of the SWIFT security controls, 16 of the mandatory ones, the 16 mandatory ones, as well as the 11 advisory controls. Now, I did want to point out that Palo Alto Networks does in fact play a role in nearly 75% of these controls. Now, if you exclude the ones related to people and processes, we have a part in all but one of the SWIFT customer security controls. So now you might ask, what else could you do for even better cyber hygiene? So above and beyond what SWIFT has laid out with their customer security controls, Palo Alto Networks has some additional recommendations. So since you can't stop what you can't see, you really need to decrypt traffic, leaving your premises. And the next generation firewalls do in fact have native SSL decryption capabilities that you can use for that. And certainly, with the next generation firewalls deployed as segmentation gateways in your internal network, you'll have to define policy for all the expected traffic. Of course, any new or changed application flows will need to be added as well. Now, these can be identified during your change management process or whatever governance process you have in place for the introduction of new apps into the environment. Now, since you'll now know what normal traffic looks like, certainly any unexpected traffic that crosses the firewalls, will be captured in the log, and those exceptions, should be reviewed as potential malicious traffic or perhaps indication of some new traffic that was introduced that didn't follow your governance process. However, additionally, what you can do is if you want to take a more automated approach to detecting in-progress attacks, or for that matter, accelerating investigations into anomalous traffic, Magnifier offers a cloud-based behavioral analytics with the power of machine learning to help identify those anomalies. And SWIFT also established their own ISAC in the middle of 2017. And their capability was expanded to support STIX taxi in 2018. So those indicators of compromise will be available in that format as well. MindMeld, which is available as open source code or is also part of autofocus, could be used to aggregate and correlate threat intelligence in that format. Now, furthermore, another function that MindMeld has is that it can actually create new prevention-based controls for the next generation firewalls, based on indicators of compromise from threat feeds. All right, so we've talked a lot about different elements of the Palo Alto Networks security operating platform. So here's just a representation of that entire platform, if you will. And ultimately, the idea here is that in order to achieve prevention outcomes, we knew that the platform had to be in all the places that your users, your devices, and your applications are in order to achieve the level of visibility and coordinated enforcement that you need. And certainly the idea of being in all those places, you can also function or serve as sensors to collect high-quality data across your network, your endpoints, as well as your cloud that you see across the bottom there in green. Now, of course, what we can do then is store and process this telemetry and log data in the cloud, which allows us then to be able to update the entire platform with threat intelligence gathered from all of the locations, as well as all of our customer base, our entire customer base. Okay, and with the Palo Alto Networks security operating platform, our customers can feel confident that they can prevent successful attacks because they can use our security capabilities effectively, as well as apply best practices. Now, because analytics are in fact used to drive automation, their teams can focus on what matters, whether that's delivering applications faster for the business, improving processes that are in place, or for that matter, just more time to hunt for threats. And with the application framework, third parties as well as customers themselves may take advantage of the data that we've collected from the sensors and enforcement points that are already in place. And the idea there is to enable them to consume new innovations quickly so you can stay on top or ahead of our adversaries. So, I guess the summary here is that, if, with the Palo Alto Networks Security Operating Platform, it's built for automation, and with that, your team is able to prevent successful cyber attacks, which ultimately will protect your business as well as your customers. All right, so here's just some closing thoughts as we wrap up. So at the end of 2017, it turned out that 89% of the SWIFT members did in fact complete that initial self-attestation. And the idea there is what you could do is incorporate information, from your SWIFT counterparties in terms of those, the attestations that they filed, and you could use that information in your own risk management process. So in other words, get your hands on a copy of their self-attestations and understand any risks that they might be bringing to your environment. Now, the next self-attestation will be due at the end of this year, and the expectation then is that all SWIFT members will be in compliance with those 16 mandatory controls. Now, again, as indicated, SWIFT may choose to report noncompliance to appropriate regulators. So certainly that's the stick they can carry. So certainly the incentive there is to to close any gaps that you may have with the mandatory controls before the end of this year. And Palo Alto Networks does in fact contribute to 75% of those controls. And if you ignore the people and the process-related ones, all but one of the technology-related controls is covered by Palo Alto Networks. And then certainly, if you want to improve your cyber hygiene even further, you can look to address or implement the 11 advisory controls, as well as adopt the additional best practices that we shared with you just a moment ago. And again, I just want to reiterate that even though the context of this is protecting the SWIFT environment, these controls really contribute to improved cyber hygiene and can really be applied to other critical resources in your environment. Okay, so on this page, just some references for you. Information, there's a link to the actual SWIFT customer security controls themselves. There's a white paper on our website that talks about how our products map to the various SWIFT security controls, both the mandatory and the advisory ones. Link to a little more discussion about it. That's our security operating platform. And then the last two are those complementary services that I mentioned earlier that may help provide some more insight into the risks in your various environments. So with that, we've actually reached the end of the prepared materials. Certainly I want to thank you for your time and attention, but now I'd like to move on to our question and answer section. So certainly feel free to enter some questions into the question box. And while we're waiting for questions to show up, let me just go back to this slide with the references for folks who may want to jot these down. All right, so certainly again, please put your questions into the box, and we'll be happy to address questions as best as possible. Okay, I do see one question here. It's asking if this webinar is CPE eligible, and I guess to be honest with you, I don't know what the answer to that is. Let's see what else we have. Okay, here's a question. Well, I guess the gist of it saying is that there's been some speculation that insiders played a role in some of these incidents, these SWIFT-related attacks. Would the SWIFT customer security controls still help? So in short, I would say the answer is yes. The guidance, again, from SWIFT is, can be broadly thought of as good cyber hygiene. And, these best practices are of general value in reducing the attack surface, whether that malicious actor is inside or outside your network. Now, certainly when an attacker gets hands on, your corporate credentials, for all intents and purposes, they're really behaving as an insider anyway. So, controls such as network segmentation and multi-factor authentication would certainly still help in cases where an insider was involved as well. Let's see if there's any other questions here. Okay, so here's just a question about, does it matter where to stop the attack in the life cycle? And the answer really is no. Ultimately, stopping the attack at any step along the way, will prevent them from being successful. Now, as we talked about when we walked through the steps of the attack life cycle, that attacker needs to complete each and every step along the way before they can achieve their ultimate objective. So certainly stopping them at any phase along the way will keep them from that objective. So the key to realize that there are multiple steps that the adversary must take to be successful. So while the good guys, the defenders, have multiple opportunities to stop them along each step of that process. Okay. Oh, here's a question asking about that. One of the complementary services I mentioned about the security lifecycle review. So how does that actually work? So again, it's something that is a freebie, and you can request that from your account team or through your partner, whichever makes the most sense. And then the idea is that what will happen is that we'll drop a next generation firewall on your network and leave it there to passively monitor for about a week. And at the end of that period, they'll deliver a report to you that explains the findings. So it'll include things like how many applications did it see, what kind of threats did they observe, did they find any vulnerabilities or exploits, malware, and it also provide a comparison against other folks in your industry. So it'll give you a sense of where you stand relative to your industry for quote unquote high risk apps. And ultimately the idea behind that security lifecycle review is to provide visibility into business and security risks. And certainly it's repeatable, so you could run it again at some future point in time after you make some changes. Let's see. Okay, so here's a question about multi-factor authentication. And one of the things I had mentioned that it's controlled at the network level, and certainly I just want the question is to kind of elaborate on what that means. So the idea there is that the next generation firewall is in front of the set of applications or systems you're trying to protect. So it's the firewall that is the one that is prompting for is challenging for the additional authentication credentials. So it's controlled, if you will, at the network level, because the firewall functions at the network level. So instead of you needing to manually or to update 5 or 6 or 7 different applications for multi-factor authentication and integrate that with your authentication service, that can all be done by the firewall that's in front of that 5 or 6 or 7 systems. So that's what I meant by saying that you can add multi-factor authentication at the network level. Hopefully that clarifies the concept. All right, let's see what else we have out there. And I guess, let's see, is there another one? Okay, here's a question. During the course of the conversation, I had mentioned using our threat prevention service for intrusion detection service for IDS. And so the question is, what else does that threat prevention include? So basically, what threat prevention does is it's a subscription that would be attached to our next generation firewall, and it scans traffic that's passing through the firewall. And in addition to IDS, IPS, it also does it offers malware protection by looking at the payload, not the hash of the traffic passing through there. It also looks for command and control signatures, and it also takes care of DNS sinkholing as well. So those are some of the additional functions that threat prevention subscription would add. So here's another question. What percentage do you think insiders represent on this kind of attacks? Should we point most of the efforts to internal measures or external firewall? Yeah, that's a good question. I think anything I would offer is strictly conjecture because it's never been confirmed that insiders were involved. I think where you would apply your efforts is really to protect the critical resources in your network, whether it's, again, the SWIFT infrastructure itself or other quote-unquote crown jewels. And I think that this is where network segmentation comes into play, right? Because the idea is that you want to limit the exposure of any portion of your environment, to make it kind of as small as possible, if you will, so that an attacker can't have free reign and just explore everything in your network. So I think the perimeter is still important, right? Because certainly you have third parties that may play a very important and prominent role in your business processes, so you want to make sure you control and limit what they can access. But at the same time, if you have the internal segmentation in place, and if you take measures to limit the likelihood of credential theft occurring, then I think that'll help you a lot. So, like I said, I don't want to guess as to how much insiders played a role here, but certainly the internal segmentation will help, and multi-factor authentication and other credential theft prevention abilities would, I think, play a key role. Okay, let's see if we have any other questions out there. Actually, I don't see any other questions. Let's just wait another few seconds to see if anything crops up. Okay, it doesn't appear we have any other questions coming in. So with that, certainly want to again thank you for your time and attention. I do appreciate you spending some time with us today. Hopefully you found one or two useful items out of this of our time together. But again, thank you very much. Do appreciate it, and look forward to talking to you again.